Hey everybody, it's Aaron, and welcome back to Lloyd's Comics and Collectibles. And today I'm going to be talking to you about miniatures as a hobby. Now, what's cool about miniatures is if you're a person that is into like collecting strategy RPGs, painting and things like that. It's a hobby that kind of encompasses all those things. So, first off, what's miniature? Well, miniature basically is a small statue. They're not quite action figures because, action figures have articulation and posability. But a miniature is a little figure. Little is relative because some, I think 70 millimeters get up to like yay tall. So, decent size action figure. But, our little figures like this. Forgive the sticky tack on this guy, because I'm still working on him, and I sticky tacked him back together to show him off. And they're used in a wide variety of ways in the hobby. Probably the most common way most people hear about miniatures is in wargaming, and we'll cover what that is later. But even if you're like not into wargaming, a lot of people use them for their live or their in-person pen and paper RPG sessions to represent characters and monsters and things like that. So that's another option that you could use if you're a D&D guy or Vampire the Masquerade or Pathfinder or just any pen and paper RPG. All you would really need is a space to represent a battlefield and some minis to represent characters and monsters. It really sort of takes it out of that realm of theater of the mind and sort of puts it on the table, and I think is a good way to keep track of things. I think that's why like digital platforms like Roll20 took off for D&D, is because it gave you, like, when you're just going around and talking and exploring things, I think theater of the mind works really good. But when you get to, like, we're in a battle and you're X feet from the goblin in front of you, I think having this visual representation that, turns it into more of a board game helps. And then there are people that, if you don't do any of those, that just like the way the figures look, they collect them and they put them on their shelves. So let's get sort of talking about each of these in a bigger detail or in more depth. And any pictures you see in this video of painted minis are from my friend Sabbat. I got his permission. He paints minis for a living on top of other things. So any pictures you see me put up are his, and we'll have links to his socials and stuff in the description or in the physical video. You should go check his stuff out. But first up, we have war games, miniature war games. And these are games, think about, like if you ever played Final Fantasy Tactics or a board game, but think of like a big table, like 40K is, I think, 6 foot by 4 foot. And it's got all this terrain on it that the players have agreed on and have painted and made. And you're fighting a mock battle between two armies, and that's the distinction to think of here, is two literal armies. And all depending on what game you're playing, they have the rules. Usually these games come with rule books and codexes that have stat sheets and things for your character. So this is really in depth, and it's like playing an RPG, a turn-based strategy RPG in real life. And these have wide varieties of themes. You got 40K that is sci-fi, Infinity that is sci-fi, Warhammer, Age of Sigmar that's fantasy. Oh, there's probably a couple other fantasy ones. And I know there's historical ones that are just based off of real-world armies from like World War II or the Civil War, and they go back and forth. And the distinction here is that you will usually, depending on the system, there might be one where like you move individual models, but you move units of models. Like, I was going to save this for later, but this is a good example. Here's a box of Orc Boys from 40K. And in 40K, you might move all of these as one mass. And there's rules in the game that state like how far they're allowed to be from each other. And then you would go to your next group of whatever troops, and you'd move those. And these games, had determined the winners in a variety of ways, because most of them had different game modes. There's some that are as simple as who has killed the most models on the table. Some have objectives, and those objectives give points, and whoever has the most points at the end of X number of turns wins. And then some of them, and I think this is cool because this bridges that gap between wargaming and the pen and paper tabletop that I talked about earlier, have narrative modes where you take a story and then you add special rules for that story and you play out that story. So your victory condition could be any number of things at that point. So that's the most common way that people hear about it. And in these games, the system that determines balance, or how many you can bring of what, is usually both players will agree on a point value to the army, and your points will be found in the rule book or in your army's codex or whatever. And that's the points you pay to bring this unit, and then you can't exceed the maximum number that they tell you. Like, let's say we're doing 1,000 points, your whole army can't equal more than 1,000 points. And that's the way they sort of do things to keep it balanced between two players. And, in narrative mode, that can go out the window because you make up your own rules. But the only problem with this getting in the hobby here at this point is tabletop war games. You're talking lots of minis, like, to get into it sometimes. Like, it could be 20 or 30 minis on the table, upwards of a couple of 100, maybe more. Depends on the point values in the armies. So sometimes getting in at this point, it's more money. But there's another alternative, and even some of the bigger war games have their version of this game. The next type of game is the skirmish game. Think everything I just said about war games, except scale it all down. A smaller table, smaller model counts. And the way I'd like to think of it, and this is going more off of using the fantasy skirmish game Infinity as an example, whereas in like 40k, I'm moving like 10 orc boys as a unit, then going over to like 10 more of something, or 10 space marine, regular space marines, and then I moved 4 space marines on bikes. A skirmish game is like you're controlling your whole army, is like a squad. Like, think of it it's like a squad from like a traditional wargaming game. And you move each model individually. This is much more like Infinity. And 40k has a version called Kill Team. It has a different rule book. Bushido is sort of a Japanese themed one along the same lines. But smaller model counts, you're playing more individual characters at that point. And then and the thing is, if you got enough models, you can throw the small scale skirmish thing out the window. I don't know how the rules would scale, but you can, if you agree on the point values in the skirmish game that are higher, you could bring bigger armies. There's no rule that says you can't. But the upside to a skirmish game is, obviously they're usually cheaper to get into because you have like 10 to 12 models on the table, as opposed to like 20 and up in like 40k. And that's reflected in the price. I'm pretty sure to get a starting army in Infinity is about $40. Like, if you decided I wanted to get into Infinity, about $40-50 you could get a starting army. And if you're going with traditional 40k and not Kill Team, because I'm not sure what Kill Team requires, you're looking at $85 to $95 US to get just the models to play the game. Now, the upside is most of these games, even skirmish games, I think sort of figured out that it's a big stepping stone to, I know the 40k base rulebook, if you buy it, is I think $65. So you're looking at like $150 just to get the stuff to play the game, and this is not including stuff to build the models, glue, and all that stuff. They realize that, and they're like, well, I can give them the rules for free. So you can just focus on buying models, get the rules for free online through their website, and you can try out the game, and that frees up some money to help you get the stuff you need to build and paint your models. So that's a good thing in today's miniature hobby world. And there's so many other things to it. It's hard to cover it all here because you can buy, like I said, terrain, and then you can customize that terrain. So you're literally building your field, your battlefield to play on. You're building a story, and that's a lot of what you will hear moving forward in the hobby is when you paint, you think of a story. And I want to encourage you guys and get it out up front. Paint your models how you want to paint them. Don't let anyone tell you how your models have to be painted. I mean, I understand more historical. There might be reasons people want you to paint them a certain way, but they're your minis. Do what you want to with them. But that covers the gaming aspect. And there are others. There are board games that have minis, and they don't really fall into, I guess, mini wargaming category. But that's the two big game types. Up next in the hobby is the one that we talked about, and is using minis as representations of characters and enemies in pen and paper RPGs. This is a good starting point too for people wanting to get into the hobby, because D&D minis are usually pretty cheap. And that's a good for you if you want to learn to paint, because you can spend less than $10 on some minis, learn to paint, and if you somehow make just a irreversible mistake, and there are very few in mini painting, there's ways to fix it or strip it or do something. If you did somehow just catastrophically mess up, you're out $5-10 as opposed to whatever a bigger mini might cost or a wargaming mini might cost. So an example that I have of that is, this is one that I got at a local gaming store. He was part of a 2-pack. It's just an Orc Barbarian for D&D. I think both of them were $6 or $7 with tax. And I mean, he looks pretty good. Now, this one is pre-prime, so he had some issues, but I mean, $5-10, cool little barbarian to mess with, right? And that is, it can be fun, because if, say, you're playing a D&D game and you had a character that you really got attached to, hey man, go get you a mini to paint and represent him. Or I think there's a site, Hero Forge, that lets you sort of design your own mini, and they'll print it out for you, and then you can paint it. And like I said, it really is a good way for battles, because it turns theater of the mind into a strategy, turn-based RPG, kind of like Final Fantasy Tactics, and you know how far you are in a representation from an enemy. And again, if you really get into it, you can build dioramas that explain an entire scene, and it's really, really nice. One example, if you can find it on YouTube, I just thought of it, is Up Up Down Down did a D&D series, which is coming back soon, called Roll Out. If you can find it on their channel, their DM had some boards that were just amazing, and it's just another thing you could use to bring that world to life. And again, I'm using D&D as the example here, but there's so many minis out there from so many companies, guys. I'm pretty sure any pen and paper you're playing, you could find something to use, find minis to use for your game. So don't think, well, they just make D&D minis, I don't play D&D. There's so many fantasy models out there. Even those Vegito minis I was talking about. If you were doing a samurai themed pen and paper, you could do that. And that's where your creativity can come in, because you can really look at what's out there, and instead of maybe being limited by a system, like with the wargaming, you can take what you want that looks cool, paint how you want to because of your minis, and tell your story. So it's something to look into, maybe if you don't have a local gaming store that does 40K, or you can't afford 40K, or you don't necessarily want to do a skirmish game, but for the same reasons. Maybe you can use them as analogs for your D&D sessions. Analogs, no, as stand-ins for D&D sessions. I think analog is the right word there. And another part of the hobby that I feel like these other two kind of inevitably at some point, if you get into it, fall into, is there are people that just paint these things for fun. And they put them on shelves like statues or action figures, like my wrestling guys back yonder, and just display them because they like how they look. There's nothing wrong with that, man. I mean, that is essentially like, imagine going into Walmart and seeing a cool action figure. But unlike Walmart, where you just sort of have to take, well, this isn't entirely true. If you get into mini painting, you could probably repaint an action figure. But imagine seeing a figure, and then you could completely customize how it looks. And there's even kit bashing. I don't have him out, but one of my space wolves, I took the Wolf Lord cape and I put it on the back of one of my Thunderwolf cavalry. So like one of my guys on the wolf has a wolf pelt cape. You can add parts. You can mix and match. You can make your own thing. There are people that even take green stuff and sculpt parts. It's just what you can do if you put in the time with minis is next to limitless. I mean, I've seen collectors and people paint armies, and then they'll just go to a competition that they have, I think, once a year, and they will literally put out these displays that is battle scenes between two armies, and it's a diorama. And I've seen some people, and you can do this for the wargaming side of things too. It's not limited to strictly, collectors. But I've seen people make display bases, and then it's like a flagstone piece of ground or whatever. And then their mini bases fit in slots in there, and it makes a diorama, which is really neat. And an upside to being a collector is, all the stuff that's just mentioned, but you're probably working on like one or two minis at a time, because you're not sitting there wanting to play a game and, I've got to field this army, or I got to get this skirmish group together. So you can take even longer painting it and just make a beautiful piece of art. And I do consider it art. Some of the things some people can do, and I'll list some of the people that have helped me, and I don't hold a candle to them, but have been real friendly to me in the hobby. You can look at their work, and whatever gets posted here in the video of Sabbat's, or I know for a fact I'm using a lot of his stuff for the written article. If you'll go to the WordPress, is just beautiful, and the things they can pull off is amazing. So I'm going to show you a few other things too, because I got to talking and working with my hands. You done seen the Primary Space Marine? I like things in armor and mechs, so they always sort of appealed to me. There was our barbarian, our orc barbarian, right? This guy's a poxwalker from 40K. I hadn't got super far with him, but I like the colors. And when I was talking about stories, plague, poxwalkers, and Nurgle is like disease and death. And I thought, well, if I'm going to make these guys kind of look dead, which we'll see if the skin gets there, make the things that were growing out of them like new life, make them like bright colors as something different to contrast. And here's it's a plague marine, but he's a special kind. I forget what he's called. And I haven't finished him, but I mean, look at that. That is cool looking. It's a big guy in armor with a giant axe, and there's no reason. I mean, you could look on the back and see some piping, but you could paint this up where he could just be a fantasy guy if you wanted to. Because that essentially looks like just heavy plate armor. And then from Infinity, the only one I dragged out, there's this guy. Like, this is sci-fi out the wazoo, guys, Look at it. Like, he's got like a sword and a submachine gun. So the worlds out there are just limitless to anyone's taste and to your imagination, and always follow the rule of cool. If you think it looks cool, do it. Because I can't get over it, because that was part of my journey when I started, is I was always comparing myself to others. And I would get discouraged and stop painting, and I need to get back to painting myself. But I'd get discouraged because, like, I'll never be that good. But that's not what this hobby is about. This hobby is about your enjoyment. Any hobby should be about you enjoying it. Who cares what other people think, collect, or do in a way that makes you happy? But this hobby really lets you do that and explore. Like, hey, I want to do this color scheme. Well, do it. It's your minis. That's the great thing about the hobby. And in closing, like I said, I think I've said it all. If you enjoy painting. But see, here's the thing. Even if you're like, man, I like the idea of playing a game, but I'm not sure about this painting thing. There are people out there who will paint your minis for a reasonable price. Now, depending on how many minis you need painted, you're going to have to pick, how much detail you want to go into it, of course, and things like that. But you can get it painted, or even if you're worried about it, there are painted D&D minis, I know for a fact, if you were wanting to do the D&D thing. So, even though I think painting and doing your own thing is the really rewarding part of the hobby, there's options out there if you don't feel comfortable painting. But I would encourage you to try it, because I promise you can do it. It'll take time, and it's not one of those things that'll get done overnight, but you can get used to it. You can learn how to do it. And it's a great way to relax. That's the thing I got out of the hobby. Sometimes when I was having a bad day, I'd just sit down with a mini and paint for a couple hours. And it was just so therapeutic to shut out all the mess going on in the world and just focus on what I'm doing. Especially maybe now with everything going on in the world. Be a good little hobby to pick up just to keep your mind off things. And one more, I was just sort of showing you what's out there. I haven't built these guys, but Sabbat sent them to me. This is for War Machine. Maybe War Machine Horror. It says War Machine. Look at these guys. Oh, isn't that cool? And you can use those for a wide variety of things. I know those are like the mechs from the War Machine series. But there's just all sorts of cool stuff out there, guys, that can really, stoke your creative energies. And maybe you didn't even know you had it. Maybe you just pick up something and try it. You're like, oh man, this is cool. But I'm going to let you guys go. I felt like I've rambled and kept you long enough. If you're interested, there'll be links in the description and on the written article to not only Sabbat stuff, but a couple of other people that really helped me and were instrumental in me learning about the hobby. Because if you get interested, Twitch is a great place to go. There are people that paint there every day and will be more than happy to answer the questions. Follow us on all the socials. Thank you guys for your time. And I'll catch you next time, guys. Peace.